Welcome. Welcome to our third Postdigital lunch organised by the Leibniz Wissenschaftscampus Postdigitale Partizipation in Braunschweig. We're really pleased today to have Michael Dezuanni from Queensland University of Technology with us today, who's going to talk about social living labs. This is really at the core of what we're doing in the Leibniz Wissenschaftscampus. So we're really pleased to be able to have our Postdigital lunch today to talk about this. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. Michael Dezuanni is Professor in the Creative Industries Faculty at the Queensland University of Technology. He's the Associate Director of QUT's Digital Media Research Centre, which conducts really very exciting research about the possibilities of creative, inclusive and fair digital media environments. I first came across Michael's work through colleagues in Canada who work with the previous co-author of Michael's, Joe O'Mara, on a really great paper on Mindcraft and using Mindcraft to enable interest-driven or passion-driven learning in educational settings. And this is in fact the topic of Michael's new book, Peer Pedagogies on Digital Platforms, Learning with Minecraft Let's Play Videos from MIT Press. After the Minecraft work though, I then discovered the work that Michael and his team in Australia had done on developing and implementing a social living labs approach. And this work was, as I said, really fundamental for our designing of the campus here in Braunschweig across our different institutes that are involved. And this social living labs approach is the focus for our discussion today. We have 1 hour of a conversation. We'll start with some questions with Michael and myself, and then, but I would encourage everybody, please, unpack your lunch, settle in to listen, but also do get your typing fingers ready and type in some questions in the Tweetback link. There's a link under the video in YouTube. You can type questions in there. I have an eye on the questions and I will try and feed them in as we go along rather than saving questions from the end. So as soon as you have a question about anything, please type it in and we'll feed it into the conversation. So, Michael, for you, this is a very late lunch being in Australia and Queensland as you are.
Yeah, it's not really lunchtime for me at all. It's more cocoa time and almost ready to go to bedtime. But it's really fantastic to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I really wanted to start with a sort of a personal question of what brought you to social living labs approach in the first place.
Yeah, so I think I really have to give you some of my background to answer that question. So I come from an educational research background. Before that, I was a secondary school teacher. And for me, conducting research has always involved collaboration. It has always, in some way or other, involved trying to solve problems that exist in the real world. So all of the research that I had conducted prior to undertaking a social living labs approach had in one way or another involved collaborations with teachers or students in classrooms. Often it involved kind of co-design work where perhaps we were trying to implement a new technology in the classroom, for instance. And so that required really close conversations with teachers to kind of understand what the problem might be and how we might solve it together. You mentioned the work on Minecraft, for instance, and I've done quite a bit of work in classrooms on the use of video games for learning, for instance. So it's kind of one of those examples. So I was already attuned to this sort of, I guess, kind of democratic approach to doing research where the researcher doesn't come in with all of the knowledge and kind of, try to transfer it to someone else or to just solve everyone's problems. The researcher comes in to really try to work with others to solve the problem. So then we began this project. We were funded to undertake a project about digital inclusion in regional and rural areas in Australia and particularly in Queensland. And that work was about working in the community to try to assist people to participate more with digital technologies if that's what they wanted to do. So it was about people who were not participating, but also people who were perhaps under participating. So who perhaps wanted to achieve new things with technology and didn't know how to do that. So a colleague of mine on the project, Professor Foth, he comes from a design background, and he suggested that we really explore the living labs approach, and that he felt that it might be the way to bring these ideas together for this project. And so we started kind of exploring living labs as an approach to trying to attack or solve these community-based problems. And as the project went on, though, and we can talk a bit more about the concept of a living lab as we go along, but living labs, I think, were originally more so designed or conceived to design new products or new processes, sometimes in very commercial kinds of ways. But what we wanted to do was something far more social than that. It was really clear to us that digital inclusion was also about social inclusion and solving social problems. So we began to kind of talk about this as kind of a socially based living lab. And we also came across Yvonne Franz's work. She's written about social living labs in the past. And so it was just a term that we started to use for the work that we were undertaking.
Yeah. So one thing, if you were already working really with co-design and collaborative processes, what did the social living labs approach give you that what you weren't already doing with co-design collaborative approaches that you had before?
Yeah, look, I think the key distinction is, and I think that that terminology of laboratory is actually quite instructive, because it is about setting up a scenario and treating it as a space for experimentation and for problem solving. But it's obviously where you take that laboratory type approach and you bring it into the community, or you bring it into a real or authentic kind of situation, rather than trying to undertake the work in a kind of isolated way. So I think that sense of it being a laboratory to solve problems in situ is really at the heart of it. And I think that is what distinguishes it from some other aspects of participatory research or even action research for that matter. So if I was talking about this in a classroom situation, for instance, perhaps, in the past, I might have co-designed a curriculum with the teacher, and then we might, test it out and see how it goes with students, for instance. But if I was to develop a kind of authentic social living lab in that classroom, then we would involve the students in the design of the curriculum in a far more active kind of way. We would actually negotiate what the content of the curriculum should be in that instance. And it's and I think one of the really kind of points of tension in living labs is this relationship that develops between the researchers with kind of so-called expertise and expert knowledge, and the participants who are wanting this, who are wanting to achieve something in a new kind of way. And so you really need to value the participants' knowledge and understanding as well, and you need to come together to solve that problem. So I think it's that kind of combination of respecting other people's knowledge, but also it happening in that authentic situation like that.
So I'm hearing that maybe it goes one step even further than what's often thought of as action research or participatory research, which works together with one part of the community, takes it maybe one step further to go with more of the community, engage more of them. And I'm also hearing a sort of boundedness. The word lab gives it a kind of boundary, which maybe makes it sets it more apart. So it's easier to see this is the bit we're doing, rather than it flowing into normal life. First of all, to talk about it and look at it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you need to have boundaries, and it needs to be contained. And so, and this means that you have to make some decisions about what it is that you're actually going to work on, and which bits you're not going to pursue, and which bits are definitely going to be part of that particular project. And this creates a tension. There's no doubt about that, because I think living labs are very, very messy, right? They're kind of a messy form of research where anything can happen at any time, and they're not really predictable, and you can't, you certainly, if you're respecting other people's input and opinions, you can't kind of just then ignore what they're saying, right? So you might come in with preconceived notions about how something should be done, but then you need to listen to people and change the approach accordingly. So they're messy in that way, but at the same time, as a researcher or someone who's kind of helping to lead the process, you do need to make decisions about what can and can't happen, and that it's sometimes difficult to negotiate that with participants as well. But yes, I think you're right about the boundedness. Yeah.
I think that tension also sounds like a really core thing. Maybe you could tell us about a specific, one of your specific social living lab events, and then we can come back to this tension again, based on something, on a specific story, an example from your research.
So this might be a good opportunity for me to share my screen and to kind of give you a bit more of a sense of what sorts of things we were up to in this project. So hopefully you can see my screen there.
Yes.
And so I'll just actually start by showing you this map of Queensland, Australia. So this is obviously where I am here in Brisbane, down in the bottom right-hand corner of Queensland. And so this project took place in two locations, really, or two general locations. So one was around this area here called Toowoomba, which is about 130 kilometres west of Brisbane. And more particularly, so we did establish two living labs in Toowoomba, and then we established one here in Pittsworth, which is a kind of a rural community. And then there was another one in a town called Oakey, which is just here. And these were actually, we chose these two communities because they were very different. So Pittsworth is very much a traditional rural town with a rural economy. Oakey, on the other hand, is sort of a small industrial centre, but also a military centre in some respects. So there's a helicopter squadron that's based near Oakey. So you have quite a number of military families living in the area. But in addition, there are abattoirs located just around this town. And so there are quite a few migrant workers who come into Australia on special skilled visas just to work in the abattoirs, and often their English language skills aren't particularly good. So we established one of our living labs there in Oakey, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then the other location was about 1,300 kilometres north in this area around Townsville. Oops, sorry. So Townsville is here. It's kind of 2/3 of the way up the Queensland coast, and it's actually quite a large centre. It has about 200,000 people living there. It's kind of a well-established centre, and one of the reasons we chose Toowoomba was because it was one of the first places in Australia to receive the national broadband network, and so we were very interested in how people living in Townsville were dealing with this, newly introduced high-speed broadband. Now, for us, for people living in Europe, high-speed broadband is not a new concept, but in Australia, and particularly with the vastness of Australia, high-speed broadband hasn't been available everywhere until relatively recently. So those were our two centres, and then this is the project website. So it's fostering digital participation using social living labs. And so these were really the 6 living labs that we established here. Now, I should say that these were the 6 that kind of emerged as being successful. And we can talk a little bit about things that didn't go so well a bit later in the session, if you like. But certainly there were lots of false starts. So when we went into these communities, sometimes things just didn't work, and things that we thought the community might like or want to do, there was just no response to. Or sometimes even when we got something off the ground and got it going, it just became very difficult to maintain, or community members lost interest, or whatever the case might be. So there are 6 here that are kind of neat and came together. There were maybe 9 or 10 that were in the mix at one point. So I'll just talk about 2 of these quite quickly, because they're a kind of contrast and show how this can play out in quite different ways. So Mix House here was based in Townsville. And so when the team went to Townsville, we began conducting interviews in libraries in the town. And so the researchers would just sit in the library and ask people if they would like to be interviewed about their use of technology and whether they would like to be using technology more, or, if they felt they were deficient in any areas, or where they were particularly skilled, and so on. And so we ended up conducting, I think in Townsville there, about 200 interviews, just to get that broad sort of sense of what was happening there. And from that point, then we would invite, we invited the subset of those people to come back for further conversations about what they might be interested in doing. And then I can talk about the specificity of this in a bit more detail, if you like, later on. But there was this kind of iterative process where we honed in on a particular kind of activity that people were quite excited about. And in this case, the decision was made to design and develop a makerspace by converting a shipping container. And so this made sense for Townsville, because Townsville is a port and there are lots of shipping containers available just, in the local community, because they're coming in and out of the city all the time. And there are quite a few that are disused and just kind of laying around. So it was possible to purchase a shipping container relatively inexpensively. And then a group of people who were involved with the local library, but also people who were involved with other aspects of digital activity and electronics and so on, wanted to make this hacker maker space. And so then the shipping container was transported around to different locations in Townsville. And so it would just kind of arrive somewhere on the back of a truck and be unloaded. And then there would be a set of activities using the gadgets and electronics and so on that were in the shipping container in that location. And then it would be transported to another part of the city and something else would happen there. So it was kind of a pop-up mobile makerspace, if you like. There's a video there that you can watch that kind of summarizes what happened. But there's just some nice images here of the shipping container being fitted out. So I'm sharing that one in a sense because it was kind of at the sort of high end of a, quite specific intervention that ended up with all sorts of gadgets and gear and involved quite a bit of high level intervention and people with, artistic skills and design skills and so on and so forth. At the other extreme, in a sense, or just a very different kind of living lab, was one called Oki Tutors. And so this one related to migrant workers who were working in those abattoirs around Oki. And when we went to Oki and we interviewed people, one of the groups that came forward was this group of retirees who were volunteering to offer English language lessons to these migrant workers. The migrant workers, and so we had an interesting situation where these volunteer retirees didn't have many digital skills, and they wanted more digital skills to be able to assist the migrant workers using digital technologies and so on. The migrant workers actually had quite a few digital skills, and they were using their mobile phones to communicate to people back home and all sorts of things like that, but they weren't I suppose, participating particularly successfully in the local community. So there was this coming together of the tutors and the migrant workers, and we brought along some expertise in the use of technologies for instruction and so on, but also some English language instruction expertise as well to that situation. And it kind of happened on a small scale, but it was quite transformative in several ways. So, for instance, eventually the kind of owners of the abattoir became quite interested in the project and what was happening, and we were able to, or not myself, but the researchers involved in that particular project were able to negotiate with the abattoir workers to enable the workers to come and do extra English language lessons, but also actually to have more access to the school, or to be able to step away from work at certain times if they needed to go to school to, for instance, speak with the teachers about their children's progress and so on and so forth. So that living lab, is quite successful in how it transformed not just that new ability to use technology in a new way, but actually it instigated social change in the community for the people involved as well. So that's kind of I guess, a more macro level discussion of those two particular living labs. I think I'll stop sharing there now so that you can see me again.
Yeah, that's really great. It's good to see and to actually see the picture inside the shipping container as well. It's my ideal of being able to buy a shipping container or something like that with the research money to do something in it and develop something together with the people in the community.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when you started talking about the mix house, the first thing I thought of was, the first thing as you were speaking, I wondered, these 200 people, how did you find these 200 people that you interviewed first? And then how did...
So actually, we just literally sat in the library and invited people to come and be interviewed. So we were just set up at a desk with a banner that was, promoting our research project. We did leave some flyers in the library to let people know we would be there at certain times and so on. We actually ended up doing some radio interviews on local radio and that kind of thing about the project. So the local library assisted us to kind of promote the project and what we were trying to do to the broader community in particular kinds of ways on their social media channels and as I said, through radio interviews and so on. But in the end, it just came down to very standard interviews and recruiting in that location, mostly on the day.
And how did you decide which of the people you wanted to invite back?
So that, and this is where I think the questions about boundedness start, right? So if you interview 200 people, then you're going to hear many different ideas and many different concepts, and you could choose to take these projects in a whole range of different directions. But I think what tended to happen was that there were particular themes that just started to come through, and you would you would hear a similar thing from several people, and it would start to suggest to you that that would be a cool thing to do or a really interesting thing to do. So in that case, the concept of a makerspace did come up quite a few times in those interviews. So, and I think it's a good example of where this wasn't just about non-participation, it was about under participation as well. So, you know, we would often hear from certain groups of people in the community that they just, you know, they didn't know how to use a mobile phone, or, you know, they were on their mobile phone and maybe they were on Facebook, but they weren't doing much more than that. And they would like to be doing more. In fact, the Pitsworth Stories Living Lab, which is one of the 6, really evolved out of that kind of concern from older local residents in Pitsworth that they were just new to social media, and they wanted to do more with social media. The other thing that sits behind all of this actually is that our philosophy going into this was that this wasn't just about using technology, it was about people's passions and interests in their community. So it was very much about listening to what people wanted to achieve for their community, as much as it was about what did they want to achieve for themselves in relation to the technology. So, yeah.
So if you were hearing people in the first 200 interviews, for example, in Townsville, saying things that went beyond, I want to learn how to use this tool or this device more, but they were talking about something about the community or some kind of,
Yeah.
then you would pick those ideas up more.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Exactly right. And, you know, we would come back together as a research team in Brisbane after these excursions to these different communities. And we would kind of say, well, you know, I heard this really interesting stuff coming through about, you know, about these migrant workers in Oakey, or, you know, there was this group of people in Townsville who seemed to be really keen on the idea of maker spaces. And this came from not just 2 or 3 people, but, you know, 7 or 8 or 9 people. And it didn't seem like these people really knew each other. It was sort of, it kind of just, these suggestions were organically coming to us. So then we would invite those people back to a meeting and introduce them to each other and say, hey, you all kind of mentioned makerspaces in these interviews. Would you be keen on doing something with a makerspace? And we've got some resources that we can bring to this, but we're really wanting to work with you as a community to make this happen. So that was kind of the catalyst then.
Yeah. I want to ask really specifically again, when you had these meetings, did you have any specific tools or methods or stuff, pinboards or whatever, which made the meeting not I'm the expert coming from the university with all this educational power or institutional power behind me, and you're the community, I'm going to talk to you? Did you do anything specific to change those relationships?
So you know, beyond, so you're talking about when we went to that next stage of bringing people together. Yeah. So it happened differently in each location, I think, depending on how we perceived each of those communities to be, and what we thought they might respond to. So yes, sometimes we got out, you know, post-it notes and butcher's paper, or, you know, we were writing on whiteboards and that kind of thing, doing this sort of typical design type work that you would want to do. But I'm just reminded of one scenario, which was at the East Creek Community Centre in Toowoomba, where this was very much a centre that people who were socially excluded would come to take part in activities. And one of the activities was knitting. So this group of older women would come together, mostly women, but a couple of men as well, would come together on a regular basis to knit together. And so we, you know, myself and a couple of the other researchers literally sat there during the knitting circle, if you like, and you know, were knitting with them. And I didn't really know how to knit, but, you know, we were just getting them to show us how to knit, you know, and then we were having this conversation about, well, would you like to do something with your mobile phones around your knitting? So it was trying to, you know, just be part of what was going on in that situation. But it wasn't always as possible to be quite that organic, if you like. Sometimes it was about inviting people to a room and saying, tell us who you are and what you would like to do, and let's brainstorm it and put it up on the board and so on.
So you really work closely with specific community actors, though, right? These libraries, which are really embedded in the community
Yeah.
and probably quite active. The East Creek Centre, which is already active there.
Yes, exactly. So, and I think that was really crucial to the success of those living labs that were successful. So, we really were relying on local actors and local organisations to support what we were doing. In some cases, we actually we employed people who were local to help the living lab happen. So at the East Creek Community Centre, for instance, there was a young fellow who frequently volunteered his time to go and help people with their tech issues. And so we ended up paying him for a period of time to help us establish the living lab that we put in place there. And because he knew people and he was passionate about what was going on in that centre, and he had those deep connections to the community, it made it much more authentic and much less of a scenario of, you know, these people from Brisbane are turning up again kind of thing.
It's a double thing there. There's the institution is also the city thing as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a question in the tweetback. Do you have any experience in implementing a social living lab approach under pandemic circumstances?
No, no.
Next question. No.
Yeah, yeah. No, and we are actually contemplating this right now because we've just got our next set of funding, which is kind of a follow up to the Fostering Digital Participation project. It's a bit different in that this project is looking specifically at low income families and how they cope with being digitally connected or not being connected. We actually got the funding for the project before the pandemic, but obviously all of the arguments we made for low-income families being disconnected have really become very, very obvious during the pandemic. So we've got the funding and everything is in place, and we need to start this project this year. And we are having to think about how we're going to visit people in their homes and how we're going to then. So the idea of this project is that we do quite deep ethnographic work with a group of families in a community, and we also go and do a lot of data collection in the social agencies that work in the community to see where the connections and disconnections are. And then at a certain point, there'll be a living labs element because we'll bring some members of the families together with people from those social agencies to develop new solutions to how those families can be assisted. So that part of it is a couple of years down the track, I think. But even with the initial phase in terms of visiting families, there are some challenges there. We are very fortunate in Australia that our COVID numbers are very low, and in Queensland in particular, apart from some minor social distancing requirements, it's kind of life goes on as usual here for us. But yeah, nonetheless, I can see how, you know, visiting community centres and so on during COVID would be very difficult and challenging.
Well, at the moment in Germany, everything's closed. The community centres are
Right.
closed, the libraries are closed, the schools
Right.
are more or less closed, most of them. And with people that we have connections with already beforehand, schools or individuals, then it can sort of go online and continue.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to begin things in this situation.
Yeah, I can imagine. I don't have any answers to that, I'm afraid. It would be incredibly difficult.
I'd like to. Oh, sorry.
No, because you know, that sense of trust and that you know, that sense of connection and that relationship that needs to develop is really crucial, and it's difficult to do that if you can't go and speak with people in person, I think.
Yeah. I'd like to come to there's a question in the chat, which in feedback, which also speaks to something I wanted to speak about. This tension of maybe it's not a tension. The question of how this thing, which is an intervention, the Oakley, the Pittsworth stories, the mixed house, these are interventions in the community.
Yeah.
But it's also a research project.
Yeah.
So maybe you could say something about the connection between the intervention and being part of the intervention, and then on being part of the community in that sense, and also writing about what's happening. That's one part of the question. And the other part is, how did you, in these examples, turn your participation into some sort of research data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think in terms of being involved in an intervention and that being simultaneously a research project, that I kind of began by saying that that's been my background, as an educator and as a teacher educator, and as someone who's been interested in how classrooms work and so on. I think educational researchers are very used to trying out new things and intervening and seeing how they go and collecting data about that. So that just felt kind of natural to me. But I can see how, if you haven't been involved with that kind of work very much, that could feel a little bit alien. And I think that it really is where, at the heart of a social living lab, is this notion of this democratic relationship between researchers and participants. Everyone just, as much as possible, needs to be on equal footing and needs to be treated with equal respect. And it actually needs to go both ways. So, of course, often people in communities are very suspicious of researchers, and they don't necessarily know what researchers can do to help them or improve their lives and so on. But that can mean that they actually are not very fair to researchers as well, right? So this democratic relationship is really about both the researchers genuinely respecting what participants have to say and what local solutions there might be that need to be listened to. But yeah, the participants also need to respect that researchers might be able to bring some new expertise or some resources or some new ideas to the situation to build something new. That's kind of crucial.
So do you make that explicit at any point with the research participants? And if so, how?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, absolutely. Look, I think we try to do it in a fairly casual way, right? So in our project, we didn't kind of bullet point it and put it up on a PowerPoint or something like that. It was very much just part of the general conversation. So if we held a meeting, for instance, in a community and introduced ourselves, we would just be upfront and saying, hey, this is the project that we're doing. We're really interested in trying out some of these ideas in your community, but we're not here to tell you, how things should be. And the reason we would like you involved is because we really think you'll be able to bring some of these answers to the scenario. But we would then articulate that, hopefully we would be able to bring something to this situation that would be helpful to you as well. And I think people mostly respond very well to that. And I think often, you see that that particular people become quite interested and quite excited about the idea, and they become your, people who you then work through, if you like. They become catalysts and champions for the project. And so that, you don't necessarily have to have that really close relationship with everyone who's involved, so long as you have a really trusted relationship with 2 or 3 people who are involved, I think.
Like the ethnographer's key informants that they would
absolutely
have had. Yeah,
absolutely.
So to this question, how do you then turn your participation and your observations into research data that you then analyze? What did you do in these projects? What sort of materials?
So some of it's just really standard qualitative methods, right? So definitely observation. So we took observational notes, or we wrote reflective journals at the end of each session. Certainly, we weren't sitting there writing our reflective notes as the activity was happening, but I would often be driving my car back from Pittsworth back to Brisbane and recording something on my iPhone about what happened in that session that day. And so I would have an audio recording of my thoughts immediately following the session, because I didn't want to forget anything. And then obviously we would just store all of those audio recordings for each member of the team to listen to. But then sometimes written notes to complement that. We took photographs and sort of documented the activities visually in that way, so that we could then have conversations with each other as researchers about the visual evidence. But we also conducted interviews during the living labs as well. So we would actually say to the participants, at various times during the activity today, we would like to take some of you aside and just have a chat with you about how you think things are going and what could be improved. And we would record those as sort of standard interviews and then transcribe those and analyze them thematically as you would any other interview transcripts.
Sort of coding kind of analysis. Mm-hmm.
Exactly, yeah. So in that sense, the methodologies or the methods, the specific data collection methods, are relatively familiar to most qualitative researchers, I think.
Mm. And then there's a link to that is two questions here from the feedback. How do you involve the practitioners in the research? Like, as in specifically, do they participate in writing, co-writing papers, things like that? And related to that, how do you share your research findings with the community? Do they read the academic papers? Do you have special publications, kind of presentations?
So again, it's sort of, this is the messiness, but it worked differently in each of the living labs depending on what the outcome was. But so with the Pitsworth Stories project, for instance, there was an exhibition at the end. So the focus of Pitsworth Stories was on, really it was about digital storytelling and memory sharing about Pitsworth. So most of the people who participated were older residents of Pitsworth. Many of them had lived most of their lives there. And so we had heard this in the initial interviews. So the living lab that we co-designed with them was one that was about Pitsworth stories. It was about telling the stories of Pitsworth. And so we taught digital photography. We taught audio recording and podcasting and a few other techniques as well. And we taught about social media and Facebook and so on, and how so for instance, many members of this group didn't know that there was a local Facebook group where people were already sharing stories about Pitsworth because they were older residents. They just weren't involved with that. So, but at the end, we took some of the photographs in particular and some of the audio recordings we had on laptops, and we held an exhibition in the local art gallery and invited members of the community along. And, the local newspaper came along and wrote a story about it. And the mayor came and, opened the exhibition and so on. So it was very much a kind of that sense of giving back to the community. The Story Yelling project was kind of similar to that. That was a group of older teenagers and people in their early 20s who were very interested in kind of independent arts practice in Toowoomba. So they developed a whole bunch of creative activity as well. And we had a launch for a website for them. We did that in a really cool space in Toowoomba, sort of, edgy sort of indie art space. And so the website launch was really the kind of public showing of what went on there. So where possible, we had a kind of authentic community-based sharing of what had happened. But yeah, that wasn't quite as possible in every scenario just because of the nature of the living lab. In terms of publishing, we didn't co-author any academic papers with community participants, but I don't see why you couldn't do that, right? I mean, certainly we've represented the voices of people in our academic publications by, authentically quoting people and trying to give voice to what people were telling us. But we didn't go to that next step of having people as co-authors of papers in that way. But yeah, sure, you could do that.
Did you do the middle step? which some ethnographers are really a fan of, who work closely with communities, and others don't like at all, of sending a draft of your chapter or your paper to someone in the community, to one, maybe your key person there, and saying, hey, what do you think? Does this really represent or not? I know that some people think that's a great thing, and it's like totally ethically, they must do that, otherwise they don't feel comfortable. And other people don't want to do that because it's got this kind of this alienating effect to the relationship that you build up. And what do you think? What did you do?
So I think we didn't really articulate it in those kinds of terms, in terms of making a decision one way or the other about that. But I think I would have to say we felt that the kind of relationship that we had developed with the participants, and trying to go for those community kind of events and so on, it just wouldn't have felt very authentic to say, here's our research paper. I think that would have felt a bit alienating to people, and they would have, started to potentially be then second guess themselves and so on somewhat in relation to those academic outcomes. I mean, we made no secret of the fact that we were writing journal articles and so on, and we told people where those were available if they wanted to read them. We certainly invited people to look at our website and so on, where our papers were available, and etc. But yeah, there was a sense that was kind of the work that the academics were doing, over there. But we would get on with solving our problems and doing, just participating more with digital technology, which is what they wanted to do, really. Yeah.
There's maybe we've got a few minutes now to come to some tensions in there, or things that went wrong, challenges that you would do differently if you did it again, or something like that. There's one I noticed from one of your publications with where you write about the 2 inaugural events: fostering digital participation and communication through social living labs, a qualitative case study from regional Australia in communication research and practice. It's one of the papers that we sent around to the campus people beforehand. In there, you mention a tension between wanting to really be on a community level and integrated with the community, but some of the workshops turning into maybe a little bit more of an expert input than you had planned.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
I'll just play that back to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I think that's that is absolutely one of those tensions where I think what happened in several cases was that we tried to establish this really authentic process of problem solving, but we potentially found that things just weren't going anywhere, and we felt like we needed to intervene more than we had intended to ensure that things kept momentum, or things kept moving forward. And there were absolutely a couple of situations where we had discussions about saying, this is all really great, but how is it research? What are we getting it from it as a research project? So I think that's, that paper is trying to represent some of those examples. Look, I think the solution to that really, and a kind of, this is always going to be an issue for researchers, I think, but the solution is that you have to become even more embedded in the community. You have to have even deeper connections. And this is bad news if you're trying to scale up, right? Because, what government is always interested in, what policymakers are always interested in, is that you find a solution to digital participation that can be scaled and that can just be rolled out in communities across the country, or whatever the case might be. But I think what we really showed through this process is that solutions need to be very localized and very bespoke, and really need to respond to local circumstances and local needs. And so what works in one community or with one group of people is just not necessarily going to work with another group of people. So what I would do differently, really, I think, is I would next time go into those communities and try to make even more community connections, try to understand the various resources that exist in the community in a really in-depth way, and then start to work with people over an even longer period of time. And I think then, you know, you would be able to overcome some of these issues that happen when everything's happening relatively quickly by necessity, because the project has to get done within a certain period of time. It's kind of that. So that's one of the key tensions. It's not really a satisfactory answer for researchers who are working on 2 and 3 year research cycles, in a way, I think.
But it does suggest that, I think in the paper, one of the chapters you talked about fly in, fly out.
Yeah.
The problem of when researchers fly in, fly out. But for me, it suggests that the first 3-year project that is funded, you know, is in a specific community and has some of those tensions, but maybe the second 3-year funded project is in the same community and then builds on what was already there.
Yeah.
Or other projects that we know of where people are working with the community, they're researching now with a community they've already been embedded in for the last 10 or 15 years for, you know, personal reasons or outside the professional context.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that can definitely happen. And I think that in some respects we've seen this happen with the Oki Tutors project in particular. So Margaret Kettle, who worked in that community, she has really maintained that relationship with that community, and she frequently goes back to that community and builds on the research year on year, and it's, you know, the results are there, right? She's been able to really make things happen for the community, but also has really developed really rich research outcomes as a result of that. So she would be an instance of where that's happened in a really authentic way with this project. Yeah.
Great. There's one more question from the tweetback. This might be the last one. If someone quickly writes another one, we might have time to answer that too. The question is, what was the shortest or the smallest social living lab that you've done, implemented, worked with?
That's a really good question. I think probably of the 6 that are on our website there, the Cool Clips project was probably the shortest. It was I think in total was about 4 to 6 weeks long, and it involved a group of teenagers who came together in one of the libraries in Townsville to work on animation skills. They were just keen to learn animation, but they were also interested in environmental issues. And so that really was quite a fairly intense, but also, quite short living lab. And look, I don't think it lost anything as a result of being short. Those teenagers didn't necessarily want to hang out with researchers for any more than, you know, a month or so.
What was short? How short was short in that context?
About 4 to 6 weeks in total. Yeah, whereas most of the other living labs in our project were at least sort of 6 months to a year, maybe 18 months long.
When you say 4 to 6 weeks or 6 months to a year, is this like, how often did they see each other, the people involved?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it's different in every scenario again, but so the ones that went for 18 months, there were probably, you know, longer intervals between the researchers being there, but the activity often continued on, and people were meeting in the community with those local champions we identified, and with other facilitators and so on, sometimes that we paid to help the activity keep going. So as a living lab and as an activity, it kept going, but we weren't necessarily there collecting data the whole time.
Right.
Yeah.
Would a social living lab approach work for you if it was like an intense 1 week thing where you spend a whole week together and you do nothing but that, but it's only a week?
Yeah, I think it could. I mean, I think it would be, yes, all the principles could be applied, absolutely. But it would be more like going on camp with a group of people, right? And just being with those people 24 hours a day, I think, for a week. That, you know, it would need to be that kind of retreat type scenario, I think. And then that sort of methodology would need to be appropriate for the problem that you were working on for that particular group of people. So I guess like with the Cool Clips project, that was a group of teenagers who just wanted this specific set of animation skills. It was something they were keen to learn about, and they got what they wanted from it, and it happened in a sort of authentic way. So it was appropriate that it was short in that sense. But you know, I think you couldn't work with that group of seniors in Pittsworth for an intensive 5 days and have the same kind of outcome. For them, it was important that, you know, we came back and that we kept in touch and that we emailed over time and that we provided feedback to what we were seeing happening online and that kind of thing over a longer period of time, because I think we had to build up that trust over time.
There's been some questions about sort of what would be an ideal size of group? What's the maximum people? How often is it helpful to meet people? And I know what you're going to answer. You can say, well, it depends. It depends on each project was different. But maybe you can, as a final question now.
Yeah, look, I think that most of our living labs had kind of 10 to 15 people involved. You know, they weren't much bigger than that, because it's hard to keep bringing a bigger group together. And even with the 10 to 15, some people came in and out. So, you know, from visit to visit. So I think that's a good size, actually. And then in terms of the frequency, I mean, I am going to say it depends a little bit, but I do think that if you can have a fairly regular ongoing presence, and it doesn't have to be a member of the research team, it needs to be a local person who has a passion about the project and who wants to see the project succeed, and that they're, you know, involved and they're bringing people together. Yes, that needs to be more frequent, and it will work better if it is more frequent.
I mean, I think that answer that you've been giving up to different questions in different ways is totally core for me to the whole thing, the whole idea of how we do social living labs, and that it really takes a qualitative approach to, or qualitative sort of epistemology, or a qualitative approach to research, and takes it into community and embeds it with people and with lives, that it really has to be specific to different contexts. And thank you so much for the different stories you've told of how it was specific in different contexts with different sets of people. That's really, really enlightening. And I think it's really helpful to hear, to free up people who think I might not be doing it right, that there isn't a right. There's a context specificity that's always necessary in these different contexts.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that, you know, there isn't one exact right way to do a living lab. You know, I think that they are by nature messy. So the kind of overall methodology and the principles of the methodology, I think you can kind of, you know, you can agree to those, and you can have those being standardized, but the actual way that these things happen is you know, is going to be as various as the different kinds of communities that you're going to work in. So yes, absolutely agree that you shouldn't feel like you're doing it wrong just because you're doing it differently to another person who's also involved in the project.
And I guess it's about this, you mentioned earlier the word iterative, this iterative, always coming back and rethinking and reassessing, where are we now? Are we getting what we want? Are we getting what we need? Are they getting what they need? Are we moving forwards the way we want to? What do we need to change? It's a key thing.
Yeah. And you do need to be willing, I think, to let go and say that just didn't work. And it's time to you know, agree that it can't go forward, or you know, it's just not going to work. So you need to be open to failure. It's what they say about all good design work. You know, you need to be open to failing and learning from your failures as well, I think.
And that's a good keyword that we could talk for another hour about, is design and what design work does in research. But I'm going to have to close just now for now. Thank you so much again, Michael Dezuanni, for joining us to talk about the social living labs approaches and your experiences and your research in this field. I want to To tell everyone that's listening or watching, 25th of February is our next post-digital lunch. It's called From Random Participation to Active Mining. People, processes, resources and spaces. And we will have Duncan Baker-Brown, an academic and an author, an environmental activist and architect, and co-founder of BBM Sustainable Design Limited, and a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton, who will be in conversation with Thilo Balke from the Technical University in Brunswick and Volker Köberling, also from the Technical University in Brunswick. So I hope to see everyone again on the 25th of February for our next post-digital lunch. Thank you again, Michael. And thank you everyone for your participation.
It's been great. Thank you very much.